A beam of electric light pierces the darkness over the calm waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The Titanic is quietly making its way through the waves, its passengers asleep, when suddenly a monstrous white shape is caught in the light beam. The fateful iceberg is about to rend the side of the legendary ship. April 14, 1912, only 2 days before someone will take a photo of a giant iceberg with a pretty unusual elliptical shape. It turns out that this iceberg most likely formed out of snow that fell 100,000 years ago. Researchers used computer modeling to figure out its origin. They used data from 1912 and added some new information about winds and ocean currents. They concluded that the iceberg was probably a part of a small cluster of glaciers in southwest Greenland. These days, it's possible to calculate the routes of such icebergs in any given year in the past. So the infamous chunk of ice was on its way from Greenland to an area further south from Cornwall. If the ship had passed through that region only 2 days later, the iceberg would have moved far away from the point where they met. At first, the weight of the most well-known iceberg in the world was 75 million tons. With time, it started to slowly melt away. And when it sank the Titanic, its weight was only 1.5 million tons. By the time of the collision, it had probably been melting for months, but it was still a true monster. When the Titanic sank, the iceberg was 400 feet long, and more than 100 feet of its surface was above the water. Some people believe it was a supermoon that caused the Titanic to sink. That night, there was a rare lunar event. It hadn't happened for 1,400 years. In normal conditions, the iceberg wouldn't have traveled so far south without melting and losing the largest part of its mass. But the supermoon could have been the reason for an unusually high tide that pulled the iceberg away from the glacier way faster than usual. There's a specific type of bacteria that slowly consumes the remains of the Titanic. Salt corrosion, ocean currents, freezing temperatures, plus this rust-eating microorganism might consume the entire wreckage. American actress Dorothy Gibson was aboard the Titanic. She survived, and when she arrived in New York, she started filming a movie called Saved from the Titanic almost right away. The movie was released only a month after the Titanic sank, and in the movie, she even wore the same shoes and clothes she had during the actual disaster. The movie was a big success at that time, but the only known copy was destroyed in a fire. 14 years before the Titanic sank, a novella called Futility had been published, and it seemed to have predicted the whole event. The plot centered around a fictional ship called the Titan that sank during its voyage. The Titan was almost the same size as Titanic, and they both went to the bottom in April. The reason was hitting an iceberg, too. Both the real and fictional ships were described as unsinkable, and both of them had the legally required number of lifeboats, which, as it turned out later, were nowhere near enough. We've seen it in the movie, but there were some real-life love stories happening on the Titanic, too. 13 couples even took a trip on the Titanic as part of their honeymoon. One of the couples owned Macy's department store in New York. Once it became clear the Titanic was rapidly sinking, the woman refused to go into a lifeboat without her husband. But he didn't want to join her while there were still women and children who he thought had to go first. Then his wife gave her coat to her maid. She insisted that the maid should get into the lifeboat, and she wanted her to be warm. As for the woman herself, she decided to stay with her husband till the end. Some people believe Titanic sank because of a mummy, not an iceberg. It all started around 1000 BCE with a mysterious woman who lived in Egypt, in the City of Thieves. People knew little about her, but they called her a priestess. Her mummy was put in a wooden sarcophagus and covered with a large lid with the image of her face and some mystical inscriptions. This place had been hidden until the first half of the 19th century, when a group of locals accidentally came across it. They disturbed her peace. No one knows how, but the mummy disappeared that day without a trace. A couple of decades later, a group of rich friends from England traveled to Egypt and found the empty mummy casket with the image of the priestess, whose dark eyes seemed to be looking into the void. They decided to buy it, but the buyer disappeared the same night before he even got the case. All members of the group had some accidents. The casket changed its location a couple of times until it, as some believe, ended up on the Titanic. It took more than 70 years for a robot submarine to find the ruins of this legendary ship. The wreck lies nearly 13,000 feet under the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, split into two halves. Why did the liner break apart? No one knows exactly. Some think it happened because of the water that got inside when the ship collided with the iceberg. The pressure was so powerful it separated two parts of the vessel, starting with the ship's bottom structure. Others say it was because of the hull rivets. They had a high concentration of slag or smelting residue, and that's something that can cause the metal to split apart. The ship generally had many flaws, starting with the design. The watertight bulkheads weren't completely sealed on top. This allowed the water to flow between the compartments and, in the end, sink the vessel. The iron of the ship's rivets and steel of the hull ended up ruined because of high sulfur content, cold temperatures, and high speeds. The steel shattered and the rivets popped out quite easily. Because of this, Titanic sank 24 times faster than it would have otherwise. If the ship had hit the iceberg head-on instead of ramming it with its side, it would have probably stayed afloat. How come the crew members didn't have binoculars? It would have surely helped them spot the iceberg on time and maybe even avoid the disaster. But the binoculars on the Titanic were locked in a storage cabinet. Only one crew member had the key, and he had been transferred off the ship right before it set sail. He later said he hadn't remembered to hand over the key. But even without the binoculars, the ship might have had some time to change course and avoid the collision if the crew had gotten some warning. But that's the thing, someone did warn them. About an hour before the incident, a ship that was relatively close to Titanic, the SS Californian, sent a message to inform them it had stopped because of dense ice field. But the warning never got to the Titanic's captain. Some experts say it was because the radio operator didn't think it was that urgent. And later, the SS Californian said they didn't get a call for help from the Titanic because their radio operator was off duty. Some say the crew on the Titanic couldn't spot the iceberg on time because of an optical illusion. Atmospheric conditions that night probably caused super refraction, which could have camouflaged the berg. After all, no one actually saw the iceberg until it was too close to the ship to somehow avoid the crash. Not even a whole minute passed between the moment they saw the iceberg and the collision. It was only 37 seconds, and it took Titanic 2 hours and 40 minutes to disappear below the ocean's waves.
It was the start of 1912. A giant chunk of ice broke off a glacier in southwest Greenland. The ice was made up of snow that had fallen thousands of years before the event, perhaps as far back as when mammoths still roamed the earth. The iceberg started its journey. It was a huge thing, more than 1,700 feet long and weighing over 75 million tons. It was also a very peaceful chunk of ice. It steered clear of ships and busy transport routes. And then, it somehow floated much further south than other bergs did. Our iceberg was lucky. Others melt long before they get to these low latitudes. Out of up to 30,000 icebergs that drift away from Greenland's glaciers, only 1% ever make it all the way to the Atlantic. Even after melting into the water for months, this massive block of ice was still almost twice as heavy as the Golden Gate Bridge. The iceberg's top part was towering 10 stories over the ocean's surface. Several days before our iceberg made it to the Atlantic Ocean, a magnificent ship left port. It was a luxury liner carrying more than 3,000 passengers and crew members. At that time, it was the largest ship ever built. It was the Titanic. The collisions happened on April 14th, when the ship was in the North Atlantic, 370 miles away from Newfoundland. Unable to divert its course, the ship ruptured at least 5 of its hull compartments. They started to fill with water at an alarming speed. The Titanic's compartments weren't capped at the top. That's why the water spilled over and started to flood each succeeding one. The front of the ship began to sink, causing the back part to lift vertically into the air. And then, with a deafening roar, the liner broke in half. The rest is history. But what happened to the iceberg after that? On April 15th, the German ocean liner SS Prinz Adalbert was sailing through the North Atlantic. It was traveling a few miles away from the place where the Titanic had sunk several hours prior. The German ship's chief steward, who hadn't learned about the disaster yet, saw an iceberg. What drew his attention was a large streak of red paint going along the iceberg's base. Surprised, the man took a photo of his discovery. He thought the paint meant a ship had hit the iceberg within the past 12 hours. The next person who saw the iceberg and took another photo of it was the captain of a vessel laying deep-sea telecommunication cables. The ship was sent to help in the area where the Titanic had sunk. The captain later claimed the iceberg he'd seen had been the only one in that area, plus the red paint. It wasn't difficult to connect the dots. In 2015, one of these photos sold at auction for over $32,000. And still, experts are unsure whether the image really shows the infamous block of ice. It might be a simple iceberg that had been floating nearby at that time. The great unsinkable ship was gone, sunken to the bottom of the North Atlantic, where it remains to this day. But the iceberg continued on its way, perplexing a few witnesses and slowly melting into the surrounding water. It would vanish completely before the end of the year.
May 31st, 1911. The second Olympic-class liner is finally complete after 2 years of construction. It'll be ready for its first voyage a year later. It's the most luxurious ship in the world. They call it Titanic. You just read the groundbreaking news in the Daily Herald and decide to treat yourself to a trip on this floating gem. You head over to the White Star Line's headquarters in London to buy yourself a ticket. You get the cheapest first-class fare for £30. That would be over $4,500 today. Wednesday, April 10th, 1912. The day is finally here. You must be in Southampton at 9:30 a.m. The third-class passengers board the ship first. Then the second and first classes follow an hour before the vessel sets sail. Stewards on board welcome everyone and show them to their cabins. Now it's your turn. The majestic ship in front of you is bigger than you imagined. As you board the Titanic, Captain Edward Smith himself greets you. Your trip will begin shortly. By the time the liner stops at Cherbourg in Queenstown, over 2,200 passengers and crew will be on board, embarking on their transatlantic trip. The Titanic is ready to sail, and you hear the horns from the deck as you wave goodbye to the people below. But just a few minutes later, you hear panic rising on the deck. You run up to the railings to see what's going on. It's another ship coming too close. The side of it says SS City of New York. Titanic has barely left the dock, but it looks like there's about to be a collision. The captain manages to steer clear of the other ship within just a few feet. Phew, that was close. The ship is scheduled to arrive in New York a week later on April 17th, but that's only if things go according to plan. The weather is clear until Sunday the 14th. As the vessel crosses a cold front, it encounters huge waves and strong winds. That night is quiet but cold. The Titanic starts getting warnings from other ships about drifting blocks of ice in the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. But this time, the great ship doesn't continue to travel at full speed. Instead, the captain slows her down. He wants to make sure the lookouts will have plenty of time to spot any icebergs along the way, even if it means arriving in New York behind schedule. It's 11:40 in the evening. Lookout Frederick Fleet spots a colossal iceberg right ahead. He immediately alerts the bridge. The first officer tells the steersman to go around the iceberg, and the rest of the crew members must stop the engines right away. Everyone on board is working together to avoid the obstacle. But in this story, the steersman doesn't panic. He immediately turns the wheel the right direction away from the iceberg. Many passengers have already been awoken by the commotion and jostling. Some go on the deck in their nightgowns and pajamas to see what's going on. A few peek over the right side of the ship to get a closer look. You and everyone else watch anxiously with white-knuckle grips on the railing. The stress and cold make you shiver. You can't help but wonder if the Titanic will collide with the iceberg. It's getting closer and closer. Onlookers hold their breath. It's so quiet you could hear a pin drop. And then, within a mere inch, the ship slowly sails by the ice monster. There was no contact, no gap ripped in the hull hundreds of feet long that would allow water to flood into the lower compartments. Everyone starts clapping and hugging each other. After doing all the necessary checks, the captain officially announces that everything is all right. He invites the passengers on the deck to come inside for a hot cup of tea before they go back to their cabins. You follow the group and see the captain leaving to go report the incident. He also alerts other ships in the North Atlantic to slow down and be on the lookout. Amongst those ships is the Carpathia. Nope, she continues on her course. No need to come to Titanic's rescue tonight. RMS Titanic finally reaches its destination on April 17, 1912. It's 8 hours late, but it's safe. Thousands of people come to the New York docks to admire the most luxurious ship in the world. It had a successful first voyage. Before getting off the ship, some passengers exchange addresses to write letters to each other. Like tennis players Richard Norris and Carl Baer. Both were on board the Titanic, but this time, Norris didn't spend hours in the cold water of the North Atlantic trying to help other passengers, almost losing his legs to hypothermia. And Baer was never on a lifeboat with his girlfriend, where he asked her to marry him. No, this time, he did it with friends and family around, and they all celebrated the engagement. The two tennis players end up playing their first match together later in 1912. Norris became one of the best players of his generation and won the Davis Cup 5 times. Margaret Brown was going back to the U.S. to see her sick grandchild. This time, she didn't have to help passengers get on lifeboats and never got on Lifeboat 6 herself. When Brown gets off the ship, she runs to her grandson's side. This time, she never met the crew or the captain of the Carpathia to give them an honorary silver cup. She kept doing philanthropic work, but she never became known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. Violet Jessup never liked the idea of sailing in the North Atlantic because she knew how bad the weather could be. She was cautious, having just survived a crash a few months earlier. It was on the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. But her friends convinced her to join the legendary ship's crew. This time, she was never called on deck to help passengers and never boarded Lifeboat 16. She continued working on the Titanic until her retirement, meaning she was never taken on as a nurse of the Britannic, and in November 1915, it didn't become the third shipwreck Jessup would survive. Bandmaster Wallace Hartley went on the voyage to make new possible contacts for future work, but he kept playing to entertain passengers. This time, he never played music to a panicked crowd of people while the ship was sinking. He survives. He goes home to his fiancée, gets married, and starts a family. He continues entertaining people on the North Atlantic run. This time, his mourning fiancée never received his violin, and the historic Titanic memorabilia was never sold in 2013 for $1.7 million. Bertha Main met the love of her life, Quig Baxter, in Brussels while he was traveling with his mother and sister. Baxter wanted to take Main with him, so he secretly booked her a cabin under the name Mrs. de Villiers. This time, he never had to guide his family to a lifeboat. His family met his girlfriend when they got off the ship, not on Lifeboat 6. This time, Baxter survived. He returned to Canada with his girlfriend, and she never went back to Europe alone. Maine's nephew would never find a shoebox in her closet with memories from the Titanic. Dorothy Gibson was playing bridge that night with a couple of New York bankers. When she went back to her stateroom with her mother, she never heard that long, sickening crunch and never got on Lifeboat 7. And in May 1912, she doesn't star in a movie about surviving the Titanic because there was no crash to survive. She went on to do great things, and she eventually moved to France with her mom. In this hypothetical story, the Titanic went on to have a successful career. It was the most luxurious ship for many years to come. It did the North Atlantic run countless times, and it successfully delivered passengers and mail where they needed to go. After 25 years in service, the old liner was scrapped. Another large vessel replaced it. It had more room for lifeboats and a large enough deck for people to walk and play. The White Star Line Company would eventually merge with their competitors. But this time, because their ships didn't sink, they made enough profit to continue going strong. In 1980, the company would become a major airline. Their first trip was from Dublin to New York. The plane was nicknamed Titanic in honor of the airline's historic ship. And this time, in 1985, the only thing oceanographers find at the bottom of the North Atlantic is corals, fish, and mollusks. And a rather large blue diamond necklace. Hold on. Nah, just some broken blue glass. Never mind. It was just a couple of hours before midnight. Some of the 2,200 passengers of a large, luxurious ocean liner were still partying in the beautiful first-class lounges. The rest were asleep in their beds, some of them in spacious cabins filled with paintings and decorated with ornate carvings, others in tiny rooms below sea level. All of these people had only one thing in common. On that chilly April night, all of them were heading from Southampton in England to New York City. The ship was called the Titanic, and at that time, it was considered unsinkable. At the very beginning of the journey, the liner nearly collided with the steamship New York. Luckily, the Titanic managed to pass by the other vessel with several feet to spare. A common sigh of relief escaped the passengers crowding the liner's decks. Little did they know what was awaiting them in the near future. Several days later, when the ship was already in the North Atlantic Ocean, 370 miles away from Newfoundland, the unthinkable happened. At about 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, those who were still awake were knocked over by some mysterious and powerful force. Passengers who were already in their beds got catapulted to the floor. Screams and total confusion. Months before the disaster struck, a ginormous chunk of ice had broken away from a glacier in southwest Greenland. It was made of the snow that had fallen about 100,000 years ago, when mammoths were still roaming the planet. When the iceberg just started its journey, it was a huge thing, almost 1,700 feet long. It also weighed 75 million tons. But then it floated much further to the south than normal, right into the area the Titanic had to cross on its way to North America. Even after melting into the water for months, the iceberg still weighed an impressive 1.5 million tons. Its top part was towering over the water for almost 100 feet. Even so, it looked harmless next to the massive ocean liner, but only at first glance. What people saw was just a tiny part of a jumbo piece of ice. The largest part of any iceberg is hidden under the surface, with a mere 1/10 visible above the water. The Titanic iceberg wasn't an exception. The moment the ship collided with it, the vessel was doomed. Unable to divert its course, it crashed into the ice, rupturing at least 5 of its hull compartments. They immediately started to fill with water, which then flooded each succeeding compartment. The front of the ship started to sink. This raised the back part almost vertically into the air, and then, with a deafening roar, the liner broke in half. The rest is history. But what if what we know about the disaster is not true? What if the ship hadn't been wrecked by an iceberg? What if it had been something more treacherous and way more alive that sank the Titanic? Far, far beneath the surface, in the ocean's dim, dark depths, a shadow lurks. Imagine an enormous creature, round, flat, and full of arms, or rather, powerful tentacles. It resembles a giant squid or octopus, but much, much bigger. Its descriptions go from as long as 10 ships to 1.5 miles long. Rumor has it unlucky sailors sometimes mistake the sea monster for an island, but instead of stepping on dry land, they're dragged down into the ocean. These people meet the Kraken, a legendary creature feared by everyone who sets off on a sea voyage. Usually, the Kraken haunts the seas off the coast of Norway through Iceland and all the way to Greenland. Who knows what has brought the beast further away from home? The waters of the North Atlantic are just as chilly, and the creature feels good and curious. Once it notices the Titanic, the ship has no chances to escape its attention. It's dark. That's why those on the ocean liner don't notice the first alarm bells. The water around the ship starts to bubble. If you strain your ears, you can hear bizarre gurgling sounds. If you strain your eyes, you can see thousands of fish and jellyfish rising to the surface. They feel something's up down below. But even if someone on the Titanic noticed this hectic activity, they wouldn't have time to get out of the way of the horrifying beast. Its enormous size and super long and strong tentacles turn it into a predator you can't escape. A 9-year-old boy standing on the deck knows nothing about the sea monster. He's just watching countless small islands rising out of the sea, very, very slowly. The kid doesn't understand why, but all the blood in his body suddenly runs cold. Hundreds of tiny fish are leaping about in the pools between these sandbanks, but soon they roll off into the water over the sides of the ginormous something. Several sharp points appear above the surface. The intrigued boy thinks they look like horns. They keep growing, thicker and thicker, the higher they rise. Soon they're towering over the massive Titanic, dwarfing the ship. These horns are the Kraken's dreaded arms. The boy is paralyzed by fear, but then he spots the monster's eye. It's as big as an elephant. It makes the kid come to his senses and dash away, screaming like there's no tomorrow. The boy's shouting attracts people. They gather along the ship's side, trying to spot what scared the child so much. And then they see. First one, then more and more passengers and crew members lean over the railing to get a better look. They aren't being careless, they're just in shock. Indeed, it's hard to believe your eyes when they tell you a dreaded beast is about to attack the ship you're on. Plus, it's dark, and no one can see clearly what that huge shadow is. But the next several minutes prove it's not a mirage. All of a sudden, the creature rises one of its monstrous arms and stretches it toward the vessel. It might very well be longer than the liner's entire hull. Women start screaming and fainting. Men seem to be just as terrified. Those who have managed to keep their heads clear sweep up kids and run for shelter. That's when the first powerful hit shakes the vessel. The Kraken's had enough waiting. It's ready for action. Panic engulfs people on board the Titanic. Running around aimlessly and screaming, they create chaos that makes the beast even more interested. Normally, the monster just wants to be left alone. It rests deep down on the ocean floor, using its long tentacles to tether itself to the bottom and lazily hunt for food. It only rises to the surface when the weather's unusually warm, or when it gets disturbed. The Titanic is probably too massive and loud. It draws the creature out of its slumber. When the beast gets to the surface and sees a large, glistening boat, wow, the thing mesmerizes the creature. It holds out one of its tentacles to touch the unusual construction. The material is hard, and the beast wonders if the thing will break when squeezed. Without wasting much time, it wraps several arms around the ship and tries to squish it. Tiny creatures fussing around, falling overboard, and making annoying high-pitched noises start to irritate the Kraken. It's getting angry. Easing its grip, the monster circles the Titanic several times, getting ready for the next attack. This time, the strike is much stronger. It bends the metal and makes it brittle. One more movement of a deft tentacle, and the ship starts to fill with water. The Kraken retreats, as if to enjoy the results of its efforts. But then, it notices the ship trying to speed up in futile attempts to put some distance between itself and the monster. People on board the Titanic heave a sigh of relief. The beast is nowhere in sight. Little do they know that the Kraken never lets its toys get away. The ship is beginning to slow down. Its rear part is slowly lifting up, and the front is going down underwater. Passengers and crew members are falling over onto the decks. Most of them are too scared to make a sound. That's why everything's happening in almost complete eerie silence. Until the ship breaks into two parts under its own weight. The crash is so powerful that it scares away even the Kraken. Spooked, the beast dives back into the ocean, which creates a massive boiling whirlpool in that spot. The suction is dragging what's left of the Titanic to the depths of the ocean. The most tragic thing here, though, the Kraken isn't even interested in people on board the ship. This creature is content to munch on fish. It doesn't need bigger prey. It's the animal's curiosity that's now pulling the huge ship down to the bottom. Does the majestic liner have any hope? I think you know the answer.
There were no binoculars on board the famous Titanic on the night when they were needed the most. The lookouts were blind, helpless, and doomed, and the ship went down, taking hundreds of lives, right? Well, it's just one of the many myths from a whole ocean of half-truths, rumors, and dramatic retellings the Titanic is still sailing in. There were binoculars on board. The real issue was access. The binoculars were locked in a cabinet in the crow's nest, which is the lookout point, but the key went missing. A crew member named David Blair, who was supposed to be on the Titanic, was reassigned to a different ship at the last minute. He forgot to leave the key behind. The key to saving hundreds of lives, literally, was sitting in his pocket far away as the Titanic was going down. But we'll never find out what would have happened if the key had been there. The sky was clear that night, but there wasn't a moon to light the way, and there was no wind, so the sea was glassy, and there were no ripples, which are the usual warning signs of icebergs floating around. Then there's the idea that the Titanic was racing across the Atlantic to break a speed record, but historians disagree. The Titanic's crew knew there was ice out there, but instead of slowing down, they just kept going, cruising around 22 knots. That's only a couple of knots slower than her top speed, but the Titanic wasn't being pushed to her limits. Many of her furnaces weren't even fully stoked.
And it was normal practice for that time to just keep going and trust those on the lookout to spot the ice before the ship hits it. Those massive Atlantic liners weren't about taking it easy. They were about being perfectly on time. Ships like the Titanic were basically the express trains of the sea, and any delay would have been a PR disaster. So, yeah, they knew the risks, but didn't think it was a big deal. After all, plenty of ships had close calls before and came out okay. They didn't see ice as a huge threat those days, and weren't even afraid of head-on collisions. And have you heard that the White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic, marketed it as unsinkable? In 1910, the company was hyping up their two new ocean giants, the Titanic and her sister ship, the Olympic. Their ads proudly declared these ships were designed to be unsinkable. What the company meant by it was that, on paper, the design should keep them afloat. Later on, they even had to clarify that they never promised the ships were actually unsinkable. By 1911, before the Titanic even hit the water, magazines were already running wild with the idea. Writers were calling her practically unsinkable, pointing to her fancy new watertight compartments as proof. And just like that, a legend was born before the ship even left the dock. After she went down, even one of White Star Line's own executives admitted during the official inquiry that when he first heard the news, he didn't believe it. He genuinely believed the Titanic couldn't sink. But that whole unsinkable thing was never the main selling point. White Star Line wasn't really pushing safety, but selling luxury. The Titanic was supposed to be the crown jewel of ocean travel, massive, elegant, and dripping in comfort. Another story that just stuck with us is that before the iceberg even struck, a coal fire was burning away in one of the Titanic's bunkers. It weakened the ship's hull and made it more vulnerable. Some people even say that fire caused or accelerated the sinking. Well, it's partially true. There was a coal fire in one of the Titanic's coal bunkers before the voyage. Fires in coal bunkers weren't unusual in steamships of the time. They could smolder for days. But it was nothing like a fire that would be raging uncontrollably. Historical timelines, crew logs, and structural analysis all indicate that a fire of such intensity and in such a position couldn't have caused fatal structural damage. If the fire had done that much harm, the ship might have failed even before the collision. But the Titanic stayed afloat for over 2 hours, which means the real villain was still the iceberg. Another twist to the fire story is that it could have distracted the crew, preventing them from dealing with the iceberg situation properly. That sounds more plausible, but still, that's not the same as saying the fire was the real culprit. Speaking of the real culprits, there's no doubt it was an iceberg, but the scale of disaster it caused was way more subtle than a big movie-style gash in the hull. Instead, it produced many tiny fractures in the ship's rivets, seams, and metal joints. Each fracture was almost unnoticeable, but because the ship was cruising, the water was steadily running through those micro gaps under pressure. It slowly seeped into multiple compartments and filled 6 of the watertight sections. The Titanic lingered, hovered, took on water, and was failing compartment after compartment. She sank over a period of 2 hours, rather than going down in minutes. If the iceberg had catastrophically torn open the hull, the ship would have gone down almost immediately, and people would have had no time to react and escape. Sadly, not all of them had that chance anyway. You probably recall the heartbreaking scene from the Titanic movie, where third-class passengers attempt to escape to the decks, but they are locked below in their section. Well, it's only partially true. Yes, there were barriers separating passenger classes, but they were mostly in place to comply with U.S. immigration laws. Third-class passengers going to America in search of a new life had to pass health checks and immigration processing. That's why they were traveling on separate decks. There were some lifeboats for them, although not in the third-class sections of the ship, so they would have to navigate a maze of corridors and stairs to reach the top. And many of the third-class passengers didn't even want to try, as they didn't want to leave their luggage behind. In the end, only about a quarter of the third-class passengers survived, but no one forcefully kept them on the lower decks. Now let's switch gears and discuss the Titanic facts that people used to deny or overlook, but which have since been proven true. For example, most deck plans and diagrams you've seen in Titanic documentaries don't show a hidden deck down under the waterline called the inner bottom. Many outside engineers did not fully understand or discuss it. This hidden deck stretched nearly the full length of the ship and had 44 separate watertight tanks. Most of them were for water ballast, some for fresh water. There were also wing tanks, port and starboard, which helped with balance. The inner bottom was like the ship's built-in organizer. It divided the Titanic into separate sections, allowing different parts to remain balanced and easier to control. It was designed to stay afloat with up to 4 of the forward compartments flooded. Sadly, the rendezvous with the iceberg opened 6 compartments, and you know what happened next. And finally, my personal favorite Titanic myth is that the ship split cleanly in half, like some Hollywood action scene. Blame James Cameron for that one. We all cried when we saw it, but reality was way uglier. For many years after the tragedy, survivors couldn't all agree on what they saw. Some said the ship went down whole. Others swore it broke apart. No one believed the second group until the scientists found the wreck in 1985. Then, they finally confirmed the truth that the Titanic had indeed broken in 2, but not neatly. The metal twisted, tore, and shredded as the stern lifted into the air, and 2 opposite forces ripped it apart. And to make it even more tragic, the people were still clinging to the back half when it snapped and plunged into darkness.
New exclusive photographs, by far the best yet, are in from the Titanic. For most of this century, that...
When the first images of the Titanic shipwreck appeared in September 1985, the world stopped. People were glued to their TVs. watching the legendary ship reappear after more than 70 years. Where did the Titanic sink, you ask? It's located about 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. This so-called unsinkable ship rests in complete darkness, about 12,600 feet below the surface. Yep, that's how deep the Titanic is. But even after such a long fall down to the ocean floor, the front part, known as the bow, still looks surprisingly intact. I mean, the railings were still there, the anchor chains too, even the elegant curves of the hull you might recognize from old photos. But the news barely mentioned the stern back then, and there's a reason we still don't talk much about it. You see, these images were about more than just capturing mesmerizing and eerie footage. They were proof of what really happened when the Titanic sank. We were finally getting some answers about this 1912 disaster, when more than 1,600 people lost their lives. And before you Google how many people survived the Titanic, I'll tell you, 706. Among those survivors, several claimed they saw the ship break apart as it went down. Others insisted it sank in one piece, and in the end, investigators agreed with them. Back then, official reports concluded that Titanic had gone down intact. So, for 73 years, that was the official story, until we finally saw the Titanic at the bottom of the ocean. When the Titanic underwater photos were released, they confirmed it. Yes, the liner really did break apart as it sank. And if we've just seen those images of the bow, that means the stern must be around there too, right? Well, kind of. I mean, we did find it. It's located about 2,000 feet away from the bow, lying on the ocean floor. So yes, it exists. But why doesn't anyone ever talk about what happened to the stern of the Titanic? Well, there's a big reason for that. See, the bow, even after all the damage from hitting the seafloor, still looks recognizable. Many of its interiors are surprisingly well preserved, and it's lying as if the ship was continuing its voyage. But the stern is destroyed. Today it's more like a twisted tangle of steel that barely looks like a ship at all. Only the parts that are more resilient, like the propellers, reciprocating engines, and rudder, have managed to hold their shape. But the rest of the stern section is melting into the seafloor. Yet, to understand why it's in such a terrible state, we need to go back to that freezing night of April 15, 1912, the night of the Titanic wreck. Just hours before the tragedy, Titanic was still sailing smoothly across the cold North Atlantic. The stern was alive with people, families talking, music playing, life going on as usual. This is where the room for passengers with the cheapest tickets were located. That's why third-class travelers were also known as steerage passengers. But the stern wasn't only for passengers. It also contained many of the ship's storage areas, including cargo holds, baggage rooms, kitchens, crew quarters, and even the engineering spaces. And hold on to that info, it's going to be important in a second. So let's jump straight to when the liner struck the iceberg. As the bow began to sink, the stern slowly lifted out of the water, putting enormous strain on the middle of the ship. By around 2 in the morning, the lights on Titanic flickered and then went out. Moments later, the ship broke in two, and the bow disappeared beneath the waves. The stern briefly settled back on the water before rising again, this time almost vertical. It stayed upright for a few seconds and then began its final plunge. At about 2:20 in the morning, the stern vanished beneath the Atlantic. Titanic was gone. What was happening beneath the water were two completely different scenarios. First, the bow slowly filled with water and began to drift downward, almost sailing gently like a submarine. Because of that, it managed to keep its shape and stayed mostly intact. But Titanic's stern collapse was a whole different story. The stern was ripped wide open where the ship had split apart. Water rushed in through that open end at incredible speed. This sudden flooding made the stern plunge downward much faster than the bow. The rush of water created so much turbulence that pieces were ripped off and scattered all around the ocean floor. Now, remember what I said earlier about the spaces inside the stern? Those huge storage areas were wide open, and many of them contained air pockets. So when the stern section broke away, it still had compartments filled with trapped air. As it spun down into the depths, this increasing water pressure crushed those pockets one by one. The surrounding structure began to implode, scattering pieces of metal, furniture, statues, and passengers' belongings across the ocean floor. So many experts believe the immense water pressure made that section collapse as it sank, and that's why we can't see much of it today. And now you know the answer to the Titanic back section mystery. We don't talk about it much, simply because there's not much left to see. It's like the part of the Titanic story that's too broken or too painful to talk about openly. The side of the ship that truly feels lost. And sorry to say this, but that's the future of the bow, too. I mean, it won't be there forever. The iconic shape of the wreck is changing year after year, and not in a good way. The front part of the Titanic is deteriorating, and one day it'll be entirely gone. Down on the seabed, the Titanic faces enormous pressure, nearly 390 times greater than at the surface. The good news is there aren't any air pockets left inside the ship, so big implosions won't happen again. But the bad news is that the ship's own weight is now helping to tear it apart. As those 52,000 tons of steel slowly settle into the ocean floor, they twist and pull on the hull. Submersible missions have already spotted large cracks running through the steel plates, and even the decks themselves are starting to cave in. And there's something else. The wreck might look cool and spooky today, but that actually comes from a thick layer of bacteria and microbes covering it. The problem is, they're slowly eating the Titanic. Yep, most of the corrosion happening down there is caused by bacteria, and this is gradually weakening the entire structure. Steel plates, beams, and supports are getting thinner every year. Scientists estimate that the ship is losing between 0.13 and 0.2 tons of iron every single day. Still, even at that rate, the wreck won't vanish overnight. Experts believe it could take up to 420 years for the liner to disappear completely. Until then, we'll keep watching this sad but natural process unfold. Parts of the ship have been falling apart little by little since the night when Titanic sank, and a lot has already changed since we started taking underwater photos, like the railing sections that have dropped and the ceiling in the captain's bathroom that's collapsed. That's why so many expeditions are now focused on capturing footage and detailed scans of the Titanic shipwreck, to preserve its memory before the ocean takes it all. It's our way of keeping the story alive, even as time and nature continue their quiet work. Maybe those hungry bacteria can take a break from their buffet, so that Titanic can rest in peace with many more years to come.
Titanic.
The Titanic.
The Titanic.
The Titanic.
Titanic.
The Titanic.
The Titanic.
Titanic.
The Titanic.
Congratulations! You can now forget everything you've seen in the movies or everything you've read in books and newspapers and heard from people. Now we have the most detailed and reliable study of the famous sunken ship. A large-scale Titanic 3D scan allows us to see in fine detail everything that happened during the disaster. And rest assured, there was a lot going on there that you've never heard of. Are you ready for Titanic new discoveries? Let's go! There's a fat chance, or a thin chance, take your pick, that there are no people here who haven't heard of what happened. But just in case, here's the quick backstory. On April 10, 1912, the giant cruise ship Titanic sailed from Southampton, England to New York City. 4 days later, the ship collided with an iceberg and sank in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. It was one of the most tragic and biggest disasters in the history of sea voyages. Since then, the wreck of the giant ship has been lying under a layer of icy water. For decades, people wanted to get this ship from the bottom many times, but they never fully tried. Passenger stories, documentaries, and books have given us a complete picture of what happened. But the only witness that can tell us about those tragic events is the ship itself. And some people decided to ask it about that night. A group of experts, oceanographers and cinematographers, recreated a virtual version of the events and showed it in the documentary Titanic: The Digital Resurrection. This is the most detailed digital reconstruction of how the Titanic sank ever made. To create it, specialists from the Magellan Company sent marine robots to the bottom where the ship lies at a depth of 12,500 feet. In such a place, all objects experience immense water pressure. To better understand how great it is, imagine the weight of a heavy barbell on your fingertip. Experienced divers with standard scuba gear can only swim at depths up to 130 feet and a little deeper. So it's a challenging, almost impossible mission to descend to such a depth and conduct research. It's dangerous for people. That's why the team of specialists sent robots there. Equipped with cameras for deep-sea surveys, they took more than 700,000 photos and videos in 4K resolution. They were collecting data for 3 weeks, exploring every part of the ship. Eventually, they had about 16 terabytes of data. Now, 1 terabyte is 1,000 gigabytes. Is that a lot? The largest game on PC, Microsoft Flight Simulator, weighs about a half a terabyte, and it has maps of the entire planet to create a realistic flight simulator. Still, this huge program weighs 32 times less than that Titanic scan. Imagine how detailed the model of the ship and the simulation of the disaster turned out to be. Moreover, the team combined all this information with the drawings of the ship. They calculated the speed of Titanic that night, its direction, its position, and the angle of impact with the iceberg. All of this was uploaded to supercomputers to create precise crash simulations. After that, specialists studied eyewitness reports, got consultations from historians and maritime experts, and then presented a detailed staging of the tragic night. Some things turned out to be different from what you know about them. For example, the iceberg didn't make a huge hole in the side of the ship. A Titanic wreckage scan shows that a piece of ice had struck a glancing blow and created several holes in the hull. Each of them was the size of an A4 sheet of paper. How could such minor damage destroy a giant ship? The problem was that those A4-sized punctures covered the entire length of the case. The Titanic's creators claimed that it was the most unsinkable ship in the world. However, its unsinkability lay in the fact that it could stay afloat even if 4 of its watertight compartments got flooded. But the collision with the iceberg led to the flooding of 6 of them. The iceberg had a mere 6.3 seconds of contact with the ship and still managed to sink it. The Titanic wreckage scan also showed a portal with a broken window. The iceberg probably crashed in there. This finding confirms the words of eyewitnesses that pieces of ice got into the cabins. Just imagine how frightening that was. You're sleeping peacefully in your bed, then you hear a loud crash, and a piece of iceberg falls into your cabin. And after that, absolute chaos begins. The researchers found out exactly how the ship had split in half. In the famous movie, we all saw how the back of the ship had risen above the water and then broken off. The ship indeed broke, but not as gently as we saw on the screen. Yeah, the scale of the disaster was terrible, but the reality was even worse. The ship wasn't just broken, it was torn in two. Wooden and metal parts of the ship, pipes, chunks of the hull, walls, everything was torn and bent. The first-class cabins were torn in two. Imagine the screeching of metal that sounded on that cold night. Researchers compared other Titanic facts versus the movie. One of them was a story about First Officer William Murdoch. In the movie, his character attacked passengers who were trying to board the boat. But in reality, everything happened differently. Titanic survivor Charles Lightoller said William Murdoch had drowned when he was trying to lower a lifeboat into the water. He didn't attack anybody, but still faced a tragic fate. There are no exact details, but high-resolution scans have confirmed this version. But one of the most impressive and heroic tales that happened on the Titanic occurred in the boiler room. With the help of robots, experts discovered that one of the boat's steam valves had been left open. This finding only confirms eyewitness stories that the engineers stayed in the boiler room for more than 2 hours after the collision with the icebergs. This group of brave people maintained a power supply until the very end. Why did they do it? Proper lighting on the Titanic helped people safely lower the boats onto the water. Electric power also made the Titanic visible to distant ships. Moreover, passengers reported that the Titanic's lights were on even when it was submerged underwater. The brave feat of the engineers helped save hundreds of passengers' lives. Who knows, perhaps further research of the ship will tell us more about other heroic actions of the passengers and crew members, actions that will be worth making a movie about. In addition to studying the ship, the researchers also scanned the seabed around the wreckage, where not only parts of the Titanic but also personal belongings of passengers, including gold coins, pocket watches, combs, shoes, and so on, were scattered. By the way, many of those items have been raised from the bottom and sold at various auctions. You can also see some artifacts from the ship in specialized museums. One of those is called Titanic Belfast and is located in Northern Ireland. It is open to the public. A digital replica of the ship not only shows us how the Titanic sank, but also literally saves the ship. The condition of the wreckage is getting worse every day. Gigantic pressure, cold temperature, water, and marine life, all of this is slowly destroying the vessel. Oh yeah, some companies that organize dive trips to the ship for tourists also pose a danger to the ship. It turns out that there are a lot of people who wanted to go down inside a submersible to the legendary wreck. As a result of some of these excursions, parts of the ship were damaged. Experts predict that within the next 40 years, the unlucky liner may disappear completely. Fortunately, the Titanic 3D scan has provided such a level of detail that you can imagine walking inside it. This means that the tragedy will never be forgotten. Of course, 10 videos like this one won't be enough to cover the full scope of the work that the filmmakers have done. Fortunately, the documentary, Titanic: The Digital Resurrection, is available for viewing. You can watch the movie and also study the 3D models of the ship. Who knows? Perhaps you can make new discoveries.
As the Titanic slipped beneath the waves, a man clung to life. And somehow, against all odds, he survived. He thought the drama was over, but what awaited him on land was way colder than the Atlantic Ocean on that dreadful night. When he returned to his home country, Japan, people met him with shame. Newspapers denounced him. Strangers whispered behind his back. His only crime, according to them, was that he didn't go down with the ship and with the other passengers. This is a real story of Masabumi Hosono, the only Japanese person on the Titanic who wrote a letter that sheds new light on the details of the well-known tragedy. Mr. Hosono was in his early 40s when he set out on his journey aboard the Titanic. He was a civil servant, working abroad for 2 years and studying the railway system. He really missed his beloved wife and children back home, so he couldn't wait for his assignment to be over. Finally, in 1912, his long return journey to Japan began. He got to travel in style with the prestigious RMS Titanic on her maiden voyage. He made it to London, where he stayed for a short time and bought a new suit, and then to Southampton. There, he took his place in Titanic's second class. As he mentioned in his writings, he was impressed with the Titanic's grand views, enticing aromas, and lively music. At this point, he was counting every sunrise as it meant he was getting closer and closer to home. On April 14th, the weather was fine, and Hosono woke up at 7 a.m. and had a regular day at the ship. Around 10 p.m., he almost fell asleep while reading, when suddenly he felt that the ship had hit something. Then the ship stopped completely. Hosono didn't take it seriously and just went to sleep. Just after midnight, a steward knocked on his door. He gave the passenger a lifebuoy and told him to go up to the lifeboat stations. Mr. Hosono quickly got dressed and rushed to the deck, where he saw passengers running around in all directions. No one could tell him what had happened. The crew had already started launching the lifeboats at that point, but he couldn't make it through. Somebody from the crew took him for a third-class passenger and told him to return to the lower part of the ship. When he finally made it to the deck, he saw women and kids getting in the lifeboats. Unlike what they show in the Titanic movie, it wasn't that dramatic, and passengers were remarkably calm. No one was shouting. Many of the men were trying to get into the lifeboats, but the sailors wouldn't let them. The crew was sending distress flares that were shining bright blue in the night sky. Mr. Hosono addressed the situation and prepared himself to end his life that day, without panic, not to bring shame upon the Japanese people. The Titanic was tilting at a 45-degree angle when one of the officers shouted that there was room for 2 more people. A man immediately jumped in. Hosono knew if he didn't do the same, he would never see his beloved family again. So he jumped inside the lifeboat, and because it was dark and so many things were going on, the conductor didn't notice that 2 men joined them. As they were rowing away from the ship, they saw many passengers still on the deck. They were screaming for help. By that time, the Titanic was tilting by about 60 degrees. After a while, they heard 3 or 4 loud bangs, and the ship disappeared underwater completely with a strange noise. He didn't mention that it broke in half, as they show in the movie. Hosono and 1 Armenian passenger were the only men in the lifeboat. The women were crying about their husbands, and husbands who went down with the Titanic. At this point, our hero realized that people would blame him for sneaking out, and it made him really sad. They were drifting, and the waves were getting higher and higher. The human voices coming from the water and begging for help disappeared. The lucky ones in the lifeboats were now afraid they wouldn't make it out alive either, as they would get hungry and cold really soon. Only around 3:30 a.m., they saw a ship in the distance. Half an hour later, the ship called Carpathia reached them. The boat that Hosono was on was the last to be rescued. Carpathia saved over 700 people from the Titanic, so it was full to the brim. When Carpathia started sailing away, Hosono saw many icebergs and was afraid there would be another collision. They got food and coffee, and when he felt that he was finally safe, he started worrying about the things he had to leave behind on the Titanic. His foreign coins, watches, new Western clothes, and especially his work notes and diary. But he still had half a sheaf of stationery with Titanic's letterhead in his coat pockets, on which he had started writing a letter to his wife in English. Now he used that piece of paper to describe everything that happened to him, this time in Japanese. This diary became the only such document known to exist on Titanic stationery. There was a roll call for the survivors and collection of personal details on the ship, and everyone received name tags. When they arrived in New York, Hosono went to the offices of a Japanese company to ask his friends to help him get home as soon as possible. Then he traveled to San Francisco and departed for Japan by boat from there. At that point, his story didn't attract a lot of attention. One American newspaper just called him the lucky Japanese boy, and that was it. When he finally made it back to Tokyo, several magazines and newspapers interviewed our hero, and one of them published a photo of him and his family. And that's when the real drama began. The Japanese press described him as a coward. Strangers sent him letters that were less than friendly. He even lost his job, although he would later get it back thanks to his valuable qualifications. The media would urge him to take his own life in the spirit of a samurai. And some even say the textbooks mentioned him as an example of how to be dishonorable. All this because people thought he had selfishly pushed aside women and kids to get into the lifeboat. They said he had embarrassed Japan, although the women and kids' first idea was not part of the samurai code. It came to Japan from the West and became one of their values only in the middle of the 19th century. Back in the United States, a writer who described the disaster in detail called Mr. Hosono a stowaway aboard Lifeboat 10. The crew member who was in charge of that boat told the US authorities that Hosono and the second man had disguised themselves as women to sneak aboard that boat. Luckily, this false accusation never reached Japan. Hosono had to live with the stigma for surviving for the rest of his life. He tried to avoid the public and didn't let his family members ever mention the Titanic in his house. He passed away at the age of 68 in 1939, and even then, he was sure that he was a disgrace to his own family and his entire country. People would shame his relatives for decades, even after his passing away. So his handwritten diary of what happened to him on that horrible April night was sitting in his drawer, well hidden, until 1997. That year, his family finally decided to publish it. Once it came out, an American researcher and Titanic scholar wrote that the diary actually contradicted other stories from that night, Apparently, someone mistook Hosono for another man who was on a different lifeboat. They said he was acting dishonorably. Hosono was rowing as hard as he could to save his fellow passengers and wasn't just sitting there as a stowaway or pretending to be a woman. That discovery finally restored his honor. The diary Mr. Hosono kept on Titanic stationery is still one of the most detailed accounts of what happened to the passengers that escaped from the drowning ship against all odds.
Over 1,500 people lost their lives in this part of the ocean, so maybe it's a prudent idea to stay away from it. The spot where RMS Titanic sank remains dangerous. I mean, yeah, there are still huge icebergs out there, but there are even bigger threats lurking beneath the surface. Titanic is sitting about 12,500 feet underwater, nearly 400 miles southeast of Newfoundland. It's been down there for over 100 years, so over time, the wreck's just been falling apart little by little. The infamous ship is rusting just like any iron or steel structure would be underwater. Chemically, when you mix iron, oxygen, and water, that combo sets off a reaction that creates iron oxide, and that's what leads to corrosion. So, steel plates, beams, all that stuff is getting weaker. Parts of the liner are caving in, like the ceiling in the captain's bathroom and a section of the railing that collapsed not too long ago. But in the case of Titanic, a lot of that corrosion is actually being caused by iron-eating bacteria. When the Titanic sank, it split into two big pieces, the bow and the stern, which landed nearly 2,000 feet apart on the ocean floor. And now, both pieces are covered in this biofilm, a living blanket of bacteria, marine fungi, and all sorts of other microbes. Over time, microbes feeding on the ship's iron have created these things called rusticles, and they are actually speeding up the wreck's decay. Scientists say the stern is breaking down way faster than the bow, mostly because it took more damage when the ship sank. And now, thanks to all that bacterial activity, the stern could be deteriorating as much as 40 years ahead of the bow. So yeah, microbes have been thriving and flourishing down there. If you are a germaphobe, that probably sounds like a total nightmare. But honestly, it's not that bad. For one, they don't even look gross. These rusticles actually look kind of cool, like ice crystals or tiny diamonds clinging to the wreck. And don't worry, you are not in danger. As long as you keep a safe distance from the wreck, no direct contact, and definitely don't go poking around inside, there really is no risk. Speaking of getting dangerously close, we've got to mention the Titan submersible disaster. You know, the one that catastrophically imploded back in 2023 during a trip to the Titanic wreck. Sadly, all 5 people on board lost their lives. Even though this trip was sold as a tourist adventure, going that deep in the ocean is no joke. It's terrifying, cold, and dark. Sunlight gets absorbed by water and can't reach much farther than about 3,300 feet below the surface. Past that point, the ocean is in total darkness all the time. Titanic lies within a region known as the Midnight Zone for this very reason. The few brave people who have visited the wreck say the descent takes over 2 hours through complete darkness. Then, out of nowhere, the ocean floor just pops into view, lit up by the submersible's lights. The second big challenge is actually finding the wreck. At that depth, navigating is no easy task. When you reach the bottom, you really don't know exactly where you are. You're just kind of fumbling around in the dark, knowing that Titanic is somewhere down there, but you can't see it. However, detailed maps of the Titanic site, made from decades of high-res scans, really do help. As the wreck starts to come into view, they can use those maps to stay on track. Plus, sonar and sensors let the crew notice features and objects even if they're way beyond the sub's tiny light pool. For example, the Titan submersible had a sensor called the Doppler velocity log. This one sent out sound waves to measure how fast the sub is moving and how deep it is, based on its distance from the ocean floor. Still, passengers on previous trips to Titanic in this submersible have said how tough it is to find their way once they reach the ocean floor. And we can't forget about the pressure. The deeper you go in the ocean, the more pressure the water puts on everything. And the pressure is crazy high at the Titanic's wreck site. To put it into perspective, it is about 200 times the pressure inside a car tire. That's why submersibles need super thick walls to handle it. So yeah, the water around Titanic has creepy microbes, pitch-black darkness, and insane pressure. But there is one more thing happening down there, and that's unpredictable currents. You're familiar with them. I mean, when you swim in the sea, you can usually feel the currents pulling you from side to side. But the deep ocean has its own set of underwater currents too. They're not as strong as the ones you feel on the surface, but they can still move massive amounts of water around. These currents can be caused by things like wind, differences in water temperature and salt, and even strange storms down on the ocean floor called benthic storms. They can get intense and stir up the sea bottom. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the Titanic wreck is in two big pieces, the front and the back, and researchers have been checking out the seabed of the surrounding area. One part of the wreck is near this cold underwater current called the Western Boundary Undercurrent. It flows south and moves mud and sand along the ocean floor, creating ripples and patterns that show how strong or weak the current is. Most of the time, the currents there aren't very strong. They even found sand ripples near where all the Titanic debris landed, like furniture, coal, and just random stuff from the ship. And those ripples are showing a current flowing from east to west. But inside the main wreck site, things get a little wilder. The water flows more from northwest to southwest, probably because all the huge chunks of the ship are messing with the flow. Around the south side of Titanic's bow, the currents get unpredictable too. They keep switching directions, from northeast to northwest to even southwest. It's like the ocean's just doing its own thing down there. Experts think that over time, all this shifting water is going to slowly bury Titanic under layers of mud and sand. Little by little, the wreck could just fade away and disappear beneath the ocean floor. Alright, now it's time to get to the obvious issue here: icebergs. Yep, they're still a problem for ships today. In 2023, around 380 icebergs flowed into the busy shipping routes between North America and Europe. That's a problem. You see, the bigger the iceberg, the easier it is to spot and avoid. Smaller ice is a lot harder to detect, though it's no less dangerous. And that's because the most dangerous part is underwater, where no one can see it. Think about the iceberg that sank Titanic. Passengers saw about 100 feet of it above the water, but it's believed that's only 16% of its total size. Experts say the rest, hidden beneath the waves and much larger than what's visible, could stretch down several hundred feet. Now, the good news is that, unlike Titanic's day, we have much more technology now to spot icebergs in time. Modern ships have radar and satellite imagery that can pick up icy threats hiding in the dark. Some vessels even use sonar and thermal imaging to see through fog, helping the crew to spot icebergs above the surface. GPS and AIS pick safer routes, and monitoring centers around the globe send out real-time alerts, like having a personal iceberg spotting assistant. So, yes, it is a massive upgrade from just relying on binoculars. You won't have to worry about icebergs on your next cruise vacation, even if it passes alongside Titanic's route. But just to be extra safe, try not to travel with anyone named Jack or Rose, and never play the violin while on board. Just saying.